How would you define New Age bullshit?
Drawing parallels between different traditions in a very naive way and saying that it's unity.
You just sort of mash it together into this like incoherent thing sometimes.
I was completely depressed. I was like, why am I here? We were planning to go stay in this like really cool hostel where all the cool people go and the young people go. And I was like, but I kind of want to stay in this ashram. And they're like, no, they're brainwashing you. Like, you know these Hare Krishna people. And I was like, I don't know what's going on. And I was starting to doubt myself.
They come to an ashram, I'm doing things I don't want to do. I'm doing sevas that I'm not interested in. Am I being brainwashed?
I was still looking more for this like mystical explosion. And if that's not it, I'm missing the mark, you know? And I wasn't able to recognize the joy of just washing the dishes. But once the Vipassana came, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to just wash the dishes because I felt like that's the way, that is the way to actually experience the love of God every moment.
Jai Gurudev Nikunja.
Jai Gurudev.
Happy to have you on the podcast.
Very grateful.
Today we want to talk about lots of different topics, but before we do that, as usual, I'd like to introduce you to our audience, how you met Guruji, what's your spiritual background. So tell me a little bit about yourself and your journey towards where we are today, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here. And I was actually reflecting, walking up, what a gift it is to be able to share from our experiences. And in my case, I was saying to some friends that one prayer I always had was to at least be able to share from my experiences because I have been given so many. And so I actually find myself to be the type of person that really is attracted to like dry philosophy and like just matter of facts, just give me the facts. You know, it's even to the point where with Guruji and satsangs, or even now in the Guru Gita commentary, when he gets to story time, I'm like, okay, listen, because my mind just drifts. It just starts to drift in story time, like stories of the Leelas or even of the saints. And I know they're beautiful, but I have a tendency to drift. But when it comes to the Bhagavad Gita or, just this kind of existential questions and inquiries right to the point, I'm like, I perk up.
Yeah, I can relate. Ironically, that's like the opposite of what Guruji says, because he's like, right. I love to tell stories because people actually pay attention to the stories and not to the other stuff. And I'm like,
yeah. So this is kind of the case for me. But I was realizing that, because we'll probably touch on the Bhagavad Gita later, it wasn't that, even though it came on early in my life, I was studying it intellectually. That's actually something that has come very recently. But it kept coming to me in very specific moments and revealing the teachings to me by making sense of experiences that I had already had, like giving me the vocabulary to sort of have an understanding of the experiences I went through. So I'm just sharing this for those that are listening and for you as I share my story and my background, to just go on that journey with me and to see that sort of thread of sort of existential truth and inquiry that is woven throughout it, but through my experiences. But they're not just mine, even though I might be talking about myself for a little while here. It's not just for me. And I always knew that about my life, because I had a friend that would say, your life has this like wow factor to it. Because very crazy things happened to me, even though I kept trying to intellectually understand or logically analyze it. Life just kept giving me these experiences that I could not explain. And so, my hope is that the stories that I share set the foundation to actually talk about the Bhagavad Gita or some of the things Guruji has guided me to do from that foundation.
Makes sense.
So, in our tradition, it is said that our first gurus are our parents.
True.
Yeah. In my case, this is very, very true, like very obviously true. At the time, I didn't quite understand how much so. Since meeting Guruji, I've actually realized it more and more. But my mother, she is brilliant, like sort of musical genius. She got her PhD in music education and was a music teacher for 30 years. and also a very, very spiritual woman. She was born Seventh-day Adventist, which is actually a form of Christianity that practices vegetarianism. So that was introduced. She snuck that in, actually, in my childhood, and I didn't even know. I have some funny stories about that. And then my father is an anomaly. He's sort of a polymath. He's like a super genius. He speaks multiple languages. He was a lawyer, a professor, a politician. And he actually didn't grow up spiritually oriented because of that. Like, he was always governed by his mind and his intellect. He even told me once, like, his term for God was like this great chemical explosion or something. But he then had supernatural experiences that led him to the path with Christ and led him ultimately to meeting my mother. So they got married. There's amazing stories, actually, for both of their lives, but I'm just prefacing that because it's by no coincidence that they were my parents. So they met and they got married, and my dad, they eventually moved to Colorado, Boulder, Colorado, which is where I'm from. And my father somehow found like the only existing Greek Orthodox church in Boulder, Colorado, which is super random. So I was baptized Greek Orthodox Christian, and that's always for people like, what? Like, that's so random. Right. Which was one of the things when I first came to this ashram, and I saw a little bit of that influence here, just here and there with the saints. I felt at home because in my home, there was icons of the saints everywhere. And my father has been writing stories, scripts, screenplays about the lives of saints, Christian saints in particular. So this was my upbringing. And I remember at the age of like 10, 11, 12, I started to have deeper thought processes. I was really inquiring into the nature of life, the nature of God. Of course, thanks to my upbringing and also my parents. And there was a particular sort of shift around 12, 13 years old where I was really starting to inquire. Mm-hmm. But at that time, my family was going through a really tough time. My father was actually in a political race, and he was, I can't remember, I was so young, but he was running for Colorado Senate or House of Representatives, and he was very high in the popular vote. So I just remember there being a lot of hype, and I was helping my dad and wearing the T-shirts, and just there was a lot of focus on him and on that at that time. But there was something that happened. Some comments came out that weren't true, but it really bumped him down, and he ended up losing by just a few percentage. And this was devastating for him. And I just remember very distinctly, and I know there were other things going on, but from my side of things, that's when things really shifted in our family. And my dad became a completely different person, which was very hard because he was like my number one inspiration because he was so profound at everything. And we would talk for hours about life, and then he just went mute. He literally went a month without talking. And then my parents' relationship changed, and then eventually it led to divorce. And it wasn't a light divorce. It was very heavy. And my mom wanted to move me out of Boulder to another town. And it would have been better in terms of like material comforts because she had met somebody else. He was well off, had a house, would have been a fine school. But something in me was like, no. It's not that I didn't have a close relationship with my mom, but I just said, no, I cannot leave Boulder. I can't. I was only 12 years old, but there was like a very strong, like, no, I cannot. And it was like a fight. And because my father wasn't well off, like after the race, he had put in a lot for that. And
imagine, yeah.
It's a long story. But in the end, I ended up just staying with my dad. But it was a very unstable situation for a few years, a couple of years, like moving from this apartment to that apartment to then having to go with my older sister because he couldn't do it. And he'd sleep in the car or we'd sleep in hotels. Like it was a total unstable mess. And it got so bad that my mom recognized what was happening and had to move back. And I moved in with her and I started high school. Things were very hard for me emotionally still, and there was still a lot of drama in the family. But it was at that time that I met someone very important who became my next teacher, let's say. And he was the older brother of my boyfriend that I had throughout all of high school. And he introduced me to yoga. And I had just turned 15 years old. And again, this conviction that I had to not leave Boulder, I had the same conviction in my first yoga class. This is my path. But not just this is my path. I said, I will be a yoga teacher. I had just taken the class. I still have the journal page to this day. And I even drew a sketch of an asana and, whatever, scribbled writing. And so I at 15, even though all this crazy drama and trauma was happening in my family, it was like grace was just flowing in so many directions, starting with yoga. And then, of course, then it just unfolds, books, things like that. I found a book on my mom's shelf called The Mastery of Love, which is, I think, very symbolic of where my life was leading me. It's by the author Don Miguel Ruiz, who wrote the Four Agreements. I don't know if you've heard of that. Okay, well, it's a very popular kind of, new age book, like Power Now, this type of thing, which I also read at that time. But anyway, The Mastery of Love was extremely eye-opening for me because it was giving me a relationship to love from many different perspectives of just what is romantic love and the sort of love that is attachment versus unconditional love. And I was really, really struck by that. And I even did an extra credit report in school on this book and saved it. And it became a major quest for me. I wanted unconditional love. And yoga, it was Ashtanga yoga, so it was very asana-based, but the teacher was a pretty world-renowned teacher. I was very lucky to have him at such a young age. So he was, weaving in the philosophy as well. And so I went super deep. I went super deep into the yogic path. And eventually I wanted to commit to that, but I didn't know if I could sort of take this unconventional route of just focusing on yogic studies or going on to university. Even though I wanted to go on to university, I actually really liked school and I did really well in school, even though I had phases of experimenting with lots of things, psychedelics and whatnot, but I was always practicing yoga. So it was happening, this spiritual awakening was happening simultaneously. So even though I got that crazy side out, it was always a part of the spiritual awakening process. So anyway, I wanted to have more clarity on whether or not to go on to university or to just, it seems so unconventional back then. Not many people were going to yoga teacher training. Now it's everyone is going to do yoga teacher trainings. Back then it was a little more wow, this is edgy. And I had a therapist at that time she was a Buddhist actually, and very fundamental in helping me through what I was going through. And she said, why don't you take a year abroad and travel a little bit? And I was like, well, I don't have any money, And she's like, well, have you ever heard of WOOF? It's a work exchange program, willing workers on organic farms. And I was also very interested in organic farming and just healthy living. That I was like, oh, this sounds like a great way to travel. And so I looked on the map. I tried to find a place as far away from home as possible. And I chose New Zealand. And I honestly didn't know anything about New Zealand. I didn't even know Lord of the Rings was filmed there. I was just I'm going as far away from this Boulder bubble as possible. And I was preparing to go. And at this time, I was with other teachers, and I actually was read the Bhagavad Gita for the first time by one of my first teachers. And I remember the exact moment, I can see it so clearly. And it was chapter 4. It was on the nature of action and inaction. And I didn't understand anything, but there was something in me that was just very tuned into it somehow, even though I didn't understand it. And eventually I made enough money to go to New Zealand. and I went to New Zealand on this soul quest. Can I be a yoga teacher, or do I have to follow the normal kind of conventional path? It was very quickly answered. I looked on the database of the WOOF exchange program. You can like search different host families. And I just typed in yoga. And what popped up? I found this place that said, yoga philosophy talks, vegetarian meals. I don't remember, some catchwords, catchy words that were like, oh, that sounds perfect for me. So I signed up, and I go to this middle of nowhere rural farm in the South Island of New Zealand. I'm like driving on this road that's like bumpy. There's nothing around. And I pull up. This car meets me in the middle of nowhere. He comes out. He has these piercing blue eyes, the Shika, super intense presence. And I was like, uh-oh. It's like, I don't know. This feels a little bit out there. And he looked at me and said, hi, my name is Chaitanya. And back then I was like, that name was so hard for me to remember. I remember it took like weeks for me to remember his name. And now I laugh about it because, Chaitanya is pretty important for the Bhakti movement. Yeah. So, he took me back to the farm, and I discovered it was an ISKCON Ashram, more traditional, very rural, and they had cows. I learned how to milk cows. And I was very, very triggered, I'm not going to lie, in the beginning, because I really wanted to be out in the garden. And I just ended up kind of doing dishes and stuff. And I was like,
Not really what I came for, right?
This is not what I want to be doing. So I was like plotting, trying to find ways to escape, but I had no way out. I was like cornered. I had to stay there. I had to stay there for like almost a month. But I ended up having a big shift and falling in love with the Gita, the philosophy discussions. And I learned how to play the mridanga. And I really fell in love, actually. I went from being extremely triggered to not wanting to leave. And when it came to time to transition on, I ended up traveling to the north of New Zealand, and I went to some vegetarian festival. And I should mention that at the first ashram, they told me about vegetarianism, and I instantly was like, oh, I'm a vegetarian now. And I've been a vegetarian since. This was back in 2012. There was literally no resistance in me. I just felt it. So then I went to this vegetarian festival, and I saw this girl going around handing out free cookies, and I noticed her Tulsi. And I was like, oh, is that Tulsi? And she said, yes. I'm like, oh, are you with ISKCON? She said, yes, there's a center here. I was in Wellington at this point, like in the capital, as more like a city. And she's like, come visit us. It's called the Bhakti Lounge. So I went there, and it was very different than the farm. It was more modern, like right in the city center, very cool, like a cool place for young people. And once again, I just fell in love with it. And I remember the first 2-hour kirtan that we had, I had like my first natural high, I call it. Because again, in high school, I had experimented with ecstasy and psychedelic psilocybin mushrooms, these types of things. Sorry, mom and dad. I still did really well in school, so, that's fine. But yes, this was the first time that I was like, whoa, and it's not just about being high for the sake of being high. It was just something really profound. Like I was just floating in this, what felt like love. And I didn't even understand the Maha Mantra or anything, but I felt it. And I was kind of going through this predicament because I was traveling with a friend, and she wanted to go. We were planning to go stay in this like really cool hostel where all the cool people go and the young people go. And I was like, but I kind of want to stay in this ashram. And I was talking to some friends back at home. They're like, no, they're brainwashing you. Like, you know these Hare Krishna people. And I was like, I know, you're right. I don't know what's going on. And I was starting to doubt myself. And I was like, maybe I am getting brainwashed. I don't know. I have like a whole journal dedicated to this time of like being confused because I thought, I think I'm a devotee. I don't know. And in the end, I was like, okay, I'm leaving. I need to get out of here. Maybe they're, controlling me in some weird way. So I tried to leave. And I was backpacking back then, so I had like a big chunky backpack and my travel guitar and yoga mat. And I put on my backpack and my neck just snapped out of the blue and went clunk. And I couldn't move my head for weeks. I was in so much pain, and it was literally impossible to travel like that. I couldn't leave. Wow. So I ended up staying with them for a couple of months. I took that as a clear sign to stay. And yeah, even one of their gurus came in, like a special visitation, and they gifted me my first sari, which is still my favorite sari to this day. There's like holes in it, but I love it. And they gifted me my first japa bag, which is still my japa bag to this day, like 12 years later. So all that being said, Bhakti, in my quest to being a yoga teacher, Bhakti was just seated right at the beginning. And it completely changed my idea of what I thought it meant to be a yoga teacher. Because the intention became about devotion to God, which I knew from my family, but when I found yoga, it wasn't so much about that. It was more about the self and inquiry and, that.
Right. I mean, it's rare to find bhakti and yoga mixed together somehow.
Yeah. So this was really a grace because it changed everything. And many things happened after that, but once I left New Zealand and went back home and I committed myself to several yoga teacher trainings, I chose a training, the first one called Teaching from the Heart, specifically because I felt that that was the guidance to keep orienting towards that devotion. And so I did a lot of trainings, and then I started teaching when I was 19. In studios, I started working for a yoga publication, a quarterly print magazine where we would talk about different concepts in yoga philosophy, but bridge it into how to take action in the world, mostly through environmental or social justice, these types of things, because I went through a pretty hardcore activism period, which is another story. But anyway, I was teaching and I was working for this publication. And at that time, I hadn't found my community, like I was kind of in this new age, kind of free form, like neo-spiritual community that was just like a mishmash of everything. And it just didn't feel right. I never felt like I belonged in it. But I kept trying to. I was like, maybe something's wrong with me. Like, these people seem to know a lot of things, or they're like tapped into something. I don't know. But I was like, I'm not feeling it. There was something in me that felt so incomplete. Like, I was like, I need the depth. Like, this is not it. And even in teaching, very shortly after finally getting what I thought I wanted, I was like, I don't even want to teach. I'm like, I don't want to teach. Definitely not in a studio. So I stopped. I quit, like literally within that year. Haven't taught in a studio since. And I kept on with the publication because it felt like at least a little more meaningful. But from that point on, once I started to feel that calling to go deeper, there was a series of teachers that were coming to me. I wasn't like guru hopping or intentionally wanting to go from path to path. In fact, I didn't want to. I kept getting actually emotionally destroyed when life was like, okay, now the next thing. I'm like, no, right. I thought I found the truth. I just want to stay here. And life just kept moving me on. First, after kind of departing from the New Age community, I went deeper into Christianity, but more from like the mystical standpoint. I had found different books on Christ, and my sister was going through a deep process with that. And so I ended up quitting the publication in that moment, even though I had the chance to travel all around the world and go to all these festivals and teach yoga and do all this great stuff. And something in me was like, no, don't go. So I went to be with my sister, and I stopped doing that kind of exciting work, externally exciting work. And we were going to church twice a week, every day. It's called One Church. It's actually very similar to Life Church. But it was like, I was feeling the depth there. and very supernatural things were happening. Very, very. I won't go too deep into it, but enough for me to feel like, okay, I'm going to be a born again Christian. I'm done with this New Age stuff. In fact, this New Age stuff is the biggest distraction on planet Earth. It's some of the most selfish work out there. Went through all of that. And
you're giving me a lot to dive into. I mean, this is great material, but please continue.
Yeah, I'm going through the fast version too to try to, get through it.
Just making all the bookmarks in my mind. I'm just like, okay, there's like about 6 topics we can explode there. But
yeah, so that happened. And then eventually, because I was with my sister in California where she was living, and eventually I went back home and I went to go visit somebody at this restaurant I had never been to. I'm sitting at this bar and this clairvoyant. So you'll hear this a lot in my story, like clairvoyants just appear and sit next to me and tell me what I have to do. And again, like this can sound very mystical and it's cool, but the most exciting part is what it leads to, which is Guruji, and how he's actually made the path more simple and actualized love and service and sincerity and authenticity, which is, I think, what we really want. But I think the mind thinks it wants these mystical experiences, and it's like, oh, it's very cool. And just, I wanted to make that as a footnote if anyone's listening to my story. Like, it is very supernatural, but what it leads to is even better. Anyway, so this being just appears in this restaurant, and he looks at me and he says, Christ's teachings are true, but the Christian path is full of corruption, and this is not where you're meant to stay. Just straight up out of the blue. I had been in California for months. No idea. This is the first time I'm in this restaurant. And this person kind of goes on and says some other things, but I was like shattered. I was really shattered in that moment because I couldn't deny what he was saying because he knew things about me and my life. And I ran away. I like literally ran away from him and went outside and was just crying and crying. And eventually some things happened, but I went through, the way I describe it to people is that when I was positioned in different paths, I went so deep because there was that longing to be completely dedicated to it. But when it was sort of ripped out from underneath my feet is what it felt like, and it started to dissolve, it wasn't that I was like, oh, it was just an aspect of truth. It was like, no, my reality felt like it was crumbling. So I went through that a few times throughout my journey, but this was one of the first most distinct moments. And then eventually I ended up going to this event in South Dakota to protect this Native American land. And I was sitting around this fire with one of my close friends, and he said, he could see something was wrong with me. And I told him, I don't know what's real. And he grabbed my hand, put it on the earth, and he said, this is real. And that really stuck with me because I had a very strong connection always to the earth and to nature, and that was a big part of my early spiritual journey as well. But then from there, connecting with Mother Earth became like my home throughout this whole journey. So that was a significant moment. And in that moment, someone said, oh, there's about to be a women's circle in the women's teepee. You should go. It's like, okay, I went. And there was this Native American shaman. She was female. She starts to speak, and she says, I'm not a psychic. I'm not here to tell you what to do or dictate your life. But if you would like to receive a message, I can communicate with your ancestors. I can communicate with your guides. If you would like to receive a message. I appreciated how she delivered it because I was really like turned off by these types of things at this point. But the way she delivered it felt very authentic. And so by the time she came up to me, she looked me in the eyes and she said, they're telling me that you're tired of this new age bullshit and you just want to hear it like it is. And I just started crying because it was exactly what was in my mind. And I knew that she was going to be my teacher for some time. So I ended up being kind of understudying with her for about a year. Again, to the point of feeling like this is my path. This is it. This is the truth. This is the way. Very beautiful, teachings from the indigenous perspective. And she was a very special and unique woman. But again, there was an experience. I was working, and some a group. They looked like a family. They were dressed in like robes and like turbans, came into my workplace and said, "We're here for you." It's like, okay. I was used to this kind of thing by now. So I was like, what now? And once again, they're saying, you need to progress forward. This is what you do. This is what you are. This is what you've been through. This is what's happening. You need to separate from this. Like knowing so many things, so many details that nobody could know about me and about my life. And so they wrote down, there were a few things happened. They wrote down their numbers, said, if you want to learn from us, call. And I was like, oh God. I didn't call them for a while, but eventually I did. And so I kind of was guided and shifted and I never really spent a lot of in-person time with them. It was mostly over the phone, but they were more of Egyptian mystics, and they were teaching from the Emerald Tablets, just like a very mystical kind of path. And that went on for some time until I arrived to, I'm going faster through the story, I arrived to Vipassana. And for those that don't know, Vipassana, it's a Buddhist meditation technique. And it's something that I had been wanting to do for so long, but it didn't line up for like 7 years. And then finally in this moment, it lined up. And I somehow knew that like before going in, I was not going to hear from those teachers again. And I didn't. But I went into the Vipassana, and it was the first time I was in a space where, well, they're very strict, right? So no prayers, no ritual, no mantra, no spiritual paraphernalia of any kind, no reading, no writing, nothing, just breathing and observation, the simple technique. And I wanted to really honor that. So I didn't do anything. I followed the rules. And it was the first time, since birth, honestly, because I had been positioned in many different paths with very distinct practices, rituals, prayers, mantras, whatever it is. So this was a very new experience for me. Even in my path of yoga, I didn't have like a super strong seated meditation practice. I was more regularly doing asana. So in the Vipassana, again, that prayer to experience unconditional love, which was really there from the beginning, that was like my main prayer and intention going into it. I can't say that I got the full blast of that, but it was the most I had ever experienced. And I was not expecting it because it was the most simple environment. There was nothing going on. And there was no teacher. There was no fancy technique. I was just sitting. I was just breathing, observing. And I just felt unbelievable ocean of love. I was crying almost every day for 10 days straight, just gushing, overflowing with love, but also almost remorse that it took me so long to just be here now, to feel the love of God here now, in the simplicity of the moment, in the simplicity of the breath. I knew it as a concept. I'd read about it. All my teachers were telling me it. But this was the first time that I experienced it. And there were some, transcendental things that happened. I won't go into it. But I usually tell people it was the most psychedelic experience of my life with no psychedelics. And then I became super adamant about silence. This is it. And I remember when I was a senior in high school, they have you pick a senior quote that goes in your yearbook. And my quote was a E.E. Cummings poem that says, "Seeker of truth, follow no path. All paths lead where truth is, here." And I kind of stuck with that because I felt like that's it. It's just here. There's no need for a path. There's no need for a teacher. Everything is just a distraction. Everything's just a game. Not only in the material world, but also in the spiritual world, because I saw so much spiritual ego manifesting in myself. Also kind of hiding behind that in myself and not having the chance to actually just be in the simplicity of the moment. So after the Vipassana, I was a totally different person. Absolutely different. And I just wanted to be normal. I didn't want to be spiritual or have a spiritual identity at all. I just wanted to be a good human. Like, okay, I want to be so mundane that I can taste this love that I felt in everything. Because if I can feel it just by sitting still in the silence, then how is this not possible in every moment? It must be. So I don't want any distractions. And to me, it seemed like all those spiritual paths I learned, but at that point I was like, it's a distraction, just a game, just like everything else. So I came out of that like this. I'm like, yeah, I just want to be a normal human. I'm done. I've had enough experiences. I'm just here to love. I'm just here to serve. I don't want to have anything to do with this world. But even though I had such a profound experience, I like descended into the deepest depression of my life because I didn't find a place to fit into the world where everyone wasn't playing the game or kind of wearing the mask or lost behind their identity that they were so attached to. And so, again, as I said before, the earth felt like home. So I decided, and there were many signs that were leading me. This is the part where it sounds very cliche. Sorry about that. But I was like, okay, I'm going to the jungle.
All the check boxes are just...
I know, right? It's like the most cliche. But this is what happened. So I'm like, I'm going to the jungle. I was going to live with an indigenous tribe. And I didn't mention this, but there was a very profound shift where I was clearly guided to never do psychedelics again. Not just psychedelics, but substances. No drinking, no smoking, no substances. It's a longer story. But it was very important because that happened right before I went through the whole Christ awakening and then the Native Americans and then the Egyptians and the Vipassana. I was sober for all those years. But knowing I was going into the jungle, I felt like, I'm going to get back into plant medicines. But why? I thought I was done with that. Anyway, so at that time I was working for a superfood company and I decided to go to this convention, go on the spiritual pilgrimage. I'm getting very close to meeting Guruji now. And I decided to make a little trip out of it. So I went to go see a teacher I really liked, just give a lecture in Encinitas. I had never been there before. And I went to my Airbnb and I decided to go on a little walk before the lecture. And I walk around the corner, literally around the corner, and I see this place, Self-Realization Fellowship. And I was like, that sounds interesting. I had never heard of it before. I don't know how, because I grew up in Boulder, Colorado, where everyone was practicing yoga and everyone had read Autobiography of Yogi. And for me, I didn't read it because everyone was reading it. Like so many times people were like, you should read this book. I'm like, no, not for me. Everybody's reading it.
I've never read it to this day.
I've also never read it to this day. So anyway, I didn't know anything about it. But I go into the Self-Realization Fellowship and I see these pictures of these masters. I remember Mahavatar Babaji's image, but I didn't know who he was, but I remembered his image. And what stood out to me was Krishna and Christ together. This really touched me because of the experiences that I had. And I was like, what is this place? So I went into the bookshop and then I saw Autobiography of Yogi. And I was like, oh, is that what this stuff is all about? Interesting. I kind of read the back cover. I didn't really like dig deep, but I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And then I left. And then I went to this lecture, went to this convention, and my mentor at the time was like, I have this really strong feeling that you're meant to go to Burning Man. And I was like, Burning Man? Like, no, this is the last thing. Maybe when I was going through my festival phase, right. When I was a teenager, I was out of that at that point for a long time. I was like, that's the last thing I want to be doing right now. No, absolutely not. But he kept pushing and pushing and pushing. I'm like, no, absolutely. I have to get my own affirmations, And sure enough, I kept getting sign, like in my face, sign after sign after sign after sign to go to Burning Man. And I was like, what? Why? And it was starting in 4 days. Those of you that know Burning Man, it's like usually you prepare for a year in advance. It's in the middle of the desert. It's like hardcore. You have to prepare and bring food, water, all this stuff. But I was like, okay, I'm going. I went back home, got some stuff, flew back to California, and I went to Burning Man. And I was riding my bike around at night, And there's all this entertainment, costumes, music, parties, art, everything you could imagine in the world of creativity. And I was completely depressed. I was like, why am I here? I don't want to be here. This is the last place I want to be. And I just start crying. And I closed my eyes and I prayed to God and I said, God, please, you brought me here. Just bring whatever it is that you are wanting to bring into my life as soon as possible, because I'm not going to make it through these 2 weeks. And the next day, I go to a camp called Camp Mystic. There were some musicians playing that I really liked. And then I bumped into some friends and I was like, oh, cool. They brought me to the middle of the crowd. And I was like, all right, at least like I like this music. And right when I got brought to the middle of the crowd, I see almost this being that is almost glowing, really, truly looking back at me. And it was Simone. For those who don't know, Simone is my husband currently, and he is the one that introduced me to Guruji. So this is the moment that we met. And it may sound like very, almost like a fairy tale, but it really was a divine moment. Like there was some recognition and that was happening beyond our human understanding. And we got closer to each other and kind of like, what's this? Or like dancing, not really talking yet. And then he starts to talk. And then we start to talk. Long story short, we talk for like 6 hours straight. And he tells me about his path. I tell him about mine. We were like reading each other's minds. It was like really crazy connection. He told me about Guruji. He told me about Babaji. He said, do you know who Babaji is? You really remind me of him. I was like, no. It didn't really like stand out much that he had a teacher. He was like, I have this teacher. I'm like, oh, cool. I've had many. Like it wasn't, I was more interested in our connection, what was going on there. And so life had it kind of orchestrate us to be also in the same camp out of hundreds of camps. Just for context, there's like more than 80,000 people at Burning Man from all over the world, and there's hundreds of camps. It's impossible to even find people you know. But Simone and I ended up being in the same camp. It's called the Camp Heart Tribe. Not only were we in the same camp, when we got there, we discovered he was set up right behind my yurt, like this. So out of 80,000 people in this giant desert, we're here, like this. And we're just like, okay, it's clearly meant to be. And even if we kept trying to leave each other and go do our own thing, we just kept like magnets everywhere around the desert. I was like, this is, okay, I've had a lot of experiences, but this is something clear. This is very clear. So we decided to explore the relationship outside of the festival environment because, you're in a festival, you gotta check things out outside of the festival environment.
Makes sense.
And he was all the while trying to convince me to come meet Guruji, the ashram, come travel with him. But I was very stubborn. I was like, no, I'm going to the jungle. I'm not interested in a teacher. I'm not interested in traveling anymore. Like I've traveled a lot, I thought. And I'm going to the jungle. Like I was very stubborn. And Simone was very smooth, actually, how he was very pushy, but in a smooth way. Now when I look back at it.
Proud of him.
And he was like, oh, I want to introduce you to Guruji. I'm going to call him. I was like, okay. I didn't know he was like kind of testing the waters and seeing if Guruji would approve, but that's what was happening. So he video called Guruji and I met Guruji over video chat. That's actually how I technically first met him. And I thought, wow, what a beautiful man. I didn't have like a profound recognition and start crying. Like I just thought, oh, he's nice. He looks beautiful. And he was making fun of Simone, like, oh, look, he's blushing. It was a really sweet moment. But I guess Simone got the confirmation he needed. So we proceeded with our relationship. And in the end, he convinced me. So I canceled my plans to go to the jungle, moved out of my house. Within a week, I told my mom I'm going to Hong Kong. She's like, what? You've done a lot of crazy things in your life, but you just met this guy and you're going to Hong Kong and, But I went to meet Simone, and then within like 2 weeks of knowing each other, 2.5 weeks maybe, he brought me here to the ashram, Shipata Nilaya, during Navaratri. So it wasn't a light entrance. We stayed for all 9 days, the celebration of Divine Mother. And I was shocked because Simone didn't give me any background. And for those of you that know Simone, it's not like he's like radiating Hinduism, Bhakti path. Like, well, he has that love, right? That shine. But I was not expecting what I walked into.
I can understand how that happened. Yeah, it's not overt with Simone necessarily. Yeah.
I was like, what? This is what? And of course, I had been in Bhakti ashrams and many experiences, but this was a shock. Not only because it wasn't what I was expecting, but I had never experienced a living master like this. And everyone kind of collapsing on the floor and staring at him. And I was like, oh my God, where am I? What did I get myself into? And I remember, I think people were really curious about who I was because I didn't know, but Simone was like close with all the monks that were like hanging out with Guruji. So they're all like, who's this girl that he brought?
Even I remember that.
And Guruji walks down the aisle and comes to me and holds my hand, and we meet in person for the first time. And again, like, it was beautiful, and I felt a lot of love from him. I felt like a surge of love, and that was very tangible. But I wasn't like, again, because I had had so many experiences and other teachers that it didn't like do much for me.
Right.
But then I went to sleep and I had a dream. And for those that know me, I have had a lot of kind of profound dreams that have come true and things in that space. So I have paid attention to my dreams throughout my journey. I had a dream, and I was with Guruji and Simone in a room. They were talking, and I'm standing in the background looking at Guruji, judging him. Just every possible thing I could judge, just in my mind, like going off. Why do you charge money for this? Why are you wearing jewelry? What are all these pictures around? Why are people bowing to you? Just like everything was just coming out like rapid fire. And then it was so strong in my mind that it came out of my mouth. I just, like, with no restraint, just started to kind of shout at him with all these judgments. And he looked at me with these fierce eyes. I didn't know those fierce eyes yet. Now I do. But it was like right to the soul. And he got up and left the room. And I realized I had done a major offense somehow. And I said, oh my God, oh my goodness, how do I reconcile this? How do I ask for forgiveness? So I sit on the bed. I'm like thinking about what to do. And then I hear this knock. And I'm like, where's that coming from? I hear it again. It sounded like it was coming from underneath the bed. And I was like, it's under the bed. I look underneath the bed, and it's Guruji. And he's there with his piercing eyes and hands like this, kind of like claws. And I'm like in complete shock. He crawls out from underneath the bed, jumps up, and I didn't understand this part of the story until I saw Paranitya Narasimha in America. But he was like this black lion with multiple arms. And I was like, oh my God, like just completely terrified, like a fear I'd never felt in my entire life. And at that point, he kind of transformed into a more familiar lion and started to chase me around the room, like roaring. And I'm like screaming. It felt like he was chasing me for an eternity. I couldn't breathe. My heart was pounding. And the lion stopped at the door, shape-shifted back into Guruji's human form. And he snapped his finger and a pen appeared in his hand. And he said, don't ever doubt me again. Write it down and never forget. And then I woke up, like flung up out of my bed. I could smell this divine smell of roses everywhere. At the time, I didn't know what that was, but later on I realized that was sort of a divine fragrance from Guruji. And so I knew there was something here for me after that. I can't say it was easy, but he definitely like left a strong impact right away. But he didn't allow me to talk to him one-on-one that first time. And I was pushing for it. It's like, I need to talk to him. Simone, I need to talk to him. He's like, well, it doesn't really work like that. And I was like really pushing, demanding almost. And Guruji did not let it happen for the whole 9 days of Navaratri. And it wasn't until we came back the next month, I think it was for Kartik, that I had my first one-on-one with him. And he started to reveal things about, our relationship and my work in the world. I don't know if we want to go into that, but that was the sort of entrance into meeting him. And I shared all of the background again because once I met him, he was the one that started to take me to the depth that I was looking for. And he started to connect the dots of the mystery of my life in a way that is very hard to put into words. But he became the answer to the prayers that I had always had, but I didn't know I was looking for him all along. And I realized that he was there all along, which there's kind of proof and testimony to that in different ways, but it's a story.
I feel like we've got a lot of content to work with here. But actually, no. Okay, so here's something I want to ask you. So because you've been through a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm.
And you also, I think you shared some of the mindsets that you were in whilst you were going from place to place and how you were feeling. Help me understand your mental process. Like, you had come to a point where I don't want paths. I don't want these things. Silence, simplicity, this thing is what kind of awoke that love and different, let's say, realizations. And then you end up with Guruji, and yeah, sure, you had the dream and this thing happened, but how does that transition happen in a way that you're comfortable to again, like, re-engage with this type of thing? How'd you reconcile those realizations that you had when you arrived at Vipassana to then being back into a path, guru, all this other stuff? Like, how does that transition happen?
I didn't reconcile it myself. Like, he definitely put me through the ringer. Like, it was many years of just breaking my mind. And I resisted for the first year very strongly. 2 years was very tough. And I kept wanting to go back to the sort of Vipassana way. I was like, this is too much. I don't want to do all this fancy stuff, How is this? Because I was trusting more in what I had received, the love that I had felt in the simplicity. I was relying more on that. I couldn't let it go. And so I guess I could share an experience that Guruji gave me in the silence, which was one of the ways that helped me reconcile it, but it was really coming from his grace, his guidance and the experiences he was giving me. Because even though I wanted to run away many times, and it was like this kind of path was the opposite of what my mind wanted at that time, there was something in me that was called to him, just felt it, and I couldn't deny it. So I just somehow, by some grace, kept trudging through what felt like just the mud. And regarding, the silence and what I felt there, and then kind of being on this path, I did one of the first silent retreats I did with Guruji. He gave an instruction, and it was like a crystal meditation. He does things a little differently every time. But in this moment, he gave a crystal meditation, and he said to chant this divine name and stare into the crystal. And I sit and I start to do it, but then again, that stubbornness came in, and I was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do my previous technique. I'm just going to go back to Vipassana. So I'm sitting there to the Vipassana technique, like just observation, clearing the mind, no mantra, nothingness, like just super attached to that. And nothing was breaking through. It was just this frustration. I was frustrated. And eventually it got to this point where I'm looking at the crystal, because we're staring into the crystal, and I start to see Vitthala, a divine manifestation, Vitthala's form in the crystal. And I'm like, no, stop, erase, as they teach you in Vipassana. No fantasy, no idealization, remove it. I'm like trying to wash it out of my mind. But no matter how hard I try, this little outline of Vitthala was just coming out of the crystal. And I was literally trying to intentionally erase it and like go back to Vipassana, observe reality as it is, because that's what the word Vipassana means. And but as this Vitthala's form is coming out, his name just starts to be chanted within me. And this was the name that Guruji originally instructed us to chant. But I said, I'm not going to do that.
Right.
And it got to the point where it was just so like overbearing, just Vitthala, Vitthala in every cell of my being, and his form in the crystal. I was completely overpowered, completely overtaken. And it was a combination of like so much love, but also I felt so bad, you know, like, first of all, I don't deserve this experience because I wasn't trusting and I was holding on to what I thought I knew was the way, what was effective. But yet still I was given this experience and I felt the same love that I felt in Vipassana, but even greater, because I understood that it was coming from his grace and that it was no longer about my effort, because I was so attached to like the effort that it takes and the discipline that it takes to control the mind and to implement that specific technique. It's very much about self-discipline and self-actualization, your ability to have this self-realization through just following those steps, those techniques. It's very systematic. But he gave me an experience where it wasn't about that anymore. It was about grace, you know, and that being, I can't say that it was a moment of surrender because it wasn't, but like he was showing me what could be.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it was very beautiful. And I felt the same love and so he kind of imprinted a new experience so that I wasn't clinging so much to the past. And I found out at this time, Simone was in the other room doing his meditation, but Guruji walked up on him and saw how he was meditating. He was laying on the couch with the crystal on a pillow on his stomach, and just like this, laying down.
Creative. Problem solver.
Yeah. And apparently Guruji came and was like, this is not how you meditate, man. Like, let me help you. So he's repositioning Simone, sitting him up, taking out the pillow, like, you know, putting him in the right posture. And Simone told me later in this moment that, Guruji was about to go in your room. So he came to the door, all while this experience is happening. And he was going to knock on the door. And apparently he put his ear to the door and he just had this like, very sweet expression, apparently like, oh. And suddenly he was like, I want to paint. So Simone's like, okay. So he like helped set him up paints literally in front of our house, like a little cottage, while I'm having this experience. And he starts to paint Vitthala. And not only did he paint Vitthala, but he gave us that painting at the end of the silent retreat. And that was one of the adesh that he gave me, was to teach silence, to share silence with the world, specifically with the corporate world, with corporate people, so that they could find peace. But yeah, it's sort of a token of that reconciliation that didn't really come from me, but just came from continuing on with him, even though there was a lot of resistance in the beginning.
I'm trying to unpack that in my mind because, you know, I think you have a collection of experiences that is unique. I mean, obviously, it's not everyone who's gone through so many different paths and experiences. And I think individually, I've met a lot of people that have tapped into some of those things, but not as a one person who's collected them all in that sense. And I think for each of these people to look at what we are, Bhakti Marga, Guruji, and to feel challenged by it, because they do, and then to overcome it, they're going to have unique challenges. Like each of them is going to have a little bit of a different concern, a little bit of a different question, a different obstacle on their way to acceptance and eventually like embracing even what we have here. You know, the Christian is going to look at this from a different angle. An ISKCON member is going to look at this from a different angle. I'm sure an Egyptian mystic would look at this from a different angle. Shamans that I know many people who used to follow that as well. They have a different, like, and concern is not the word I want to use, but it's like something that stands between them and this in a way. And sometimes it's going to be resolved healthily, and that's why I don't want to use the word concern, because sometimes it's more like this is just whatever question is coming up between where I'm standing from originally and where Guruji is standing is actually incredibly productive, or helps me to grow and whatever else. Sometimes it's really an obstacle. It's just something that you've really set yourself up with, an attachment or whatever it is, and you've really got to somehow find your way around it. But when I asked you the question, and now that you've shared this experience, it almost feels like, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it almost feels like Guruji has to do it for you, almost, not fully, but it's almost like if grace doesn't show you what you're missing or what you don't even know exists somehow, and almost compel you into that experience, either through like a little drop or a little like momentary experience or whatever it is, it almost feels like you're just not going to do it, because the human psyche, the way we're set up somehow, I don't know, it feels limiting. It feels like we don't know what we don't know, right? And it's like, I understand these people when they have these difficulties with Guruji. I feel an immense amount of compassion always. But at the same time, all I feel like telling them is, give him a shot to show you what you don't know he can show you. And then let's talk. Because I'm used to, look, in my position here as a public figure, whatever it is, I'll get people challenging, Guruji and my belief in him all the time. And I get a lot of devotees who come to me as a Swami and say, help me overcome these obstacles that we've mapped out. And it feels almost to me like I'm always playing a mental game with them, where I'm trying to sort of find where's the issue and what argument could I use. But a part of me is always just screaming like, just give it a chance. Like, there's no argument I want to give you. Just come and meet him. And not for 5 seconds, maybe for 5 months, and see what happens. Like, go and sit and do a meditation with him. Do Vipassana if he tells you to do chanting. Rebel. Do whatever it takes, but just let him do his thing, and then come back and talk to me after that, right? Because I feel like what you've described to me is not really an intellectual process. It's not that you analyzed your way towards Guruji being great. That's not how it comes across to me. It's more like I've had experiences that somehow reveal almost like an innate thing. And my question then is like, how to best smoothly convince these people, like Simone did with you almost, to give it a shot. Because I like I said, I really do feel compassion for the challenge, what you did in your dream, judging him. Yeah, I get it. I get it a lot. I think he sets himself up to be judged on purpose. I was talking to a Swami from another Vaishnava movement recently, and I was explaining to him, like, if whatever Guruji's like supposed to be by the letter of the tradition, he does everything in his power to not be that. And then people like look at him like, oh, he wears this jewelry, he does all this stuff just because he wants to be famous, or because of ego or whatever. And I'm like, do you realize that as a Vaishnava guru, to wear those things makes you infamous in a sense? Like, it makes you famous, but all for all the wrong reasons. Like, you're just attracting negative criticism and negative opinions.
That's
like,
true.
Vaishnavas aren't looking for that, right? It's your number one ticket to criticism. And yet he's not dumb. He's well aware of this, and yet he does it. Why do you think so? Like, and just to start questioning those belief systems and questioning those assumptions and challenging all of that. And I think what intrigues me so much about your story is just, I feel like to be of service to God, there are many, many different ways we can do this. I mean, what you just shared now about like bringing silence to people, I think that's awesome. And it's very different to a lot of other services that I see around, or even I've been asked to do. I'm here talking all the time, right? Definitely not teaching silence. And I feel like to be a master of keys, to look at people's hearts and minds as locks that you need to somehow find the right key. And I really want to be of the most service. I want to help people become of service to God, to love, to all these things. And it's just, nothing really replaces grace. But at the same time, I think experience, which you have in abundance, it seems, is something to be learned from. And so when you said at the very beginning that your life is for others to also learn from and understand, I can understand why you said that. Makes sense to me. And so what I would like to do, if we can, is maybe not through all of them because it might take too long, but just to, and maybe we can do more episodes together, to be honest, because there was a lot there.
It was a lot, I know.
But I feel like I want to dig a little deeper into, like if you were to speak to some of the older versions of you, if you were to speak to you doing yoga, you at the Hare Krishna ashram, you with the Egyptian mystics, you with the shamans, you with the Christians, like what would be the things you'd be saying to them, to those versions of you? Because I think other people listening and watching this are going to identify with that version of you. It's like, oh, I'm that person, or I'm that version of Nikunja, I'm that version of Nikunja, but now we have this version of Nikunja. And so like, I don't know if you, like, when we do this little exercise, like what would you instinctively like feel like you would say to those versions of yourself, or people who would identify with that version of yourself, to help them understand and to maybe connect with what we've got now? Because I'm assuming you feel more fulfilled now with what you've got than what you did before, right? So let's do this. I think it could be interesting.
Yeah. Already immediately, what comes to me is love and service. Of course, sounds very simple and easier said than done. But if I could go back to these different versions of myself, I would just inspire to focus on that, to the essence of love and service, regardless of the sort of external identity that I was taking on in the given lineage. But for me, and in my experiences, even though that has been the common thread, this love and service, not just in general, but to God, to a higher intelligence. Because in every path that I was in, aside from the Vipassana, the Buddhist path doesn't necessarily explicitly speak to that relationship, but the other paths, yes. Ultimately, I would tell myself to focus on the love and service to in every moment, and to the people in my life, which is interesting because, again, during the Vipassana, when I felt like I just want to be a normal human being, like I just want to hopefully be, a decent human being and engage in mundane activity with the utmost love and care and service. And the irony is that Guruji is the one that has made that more real, than anything I'd ever experienced, even though the sort of outer package that is in, such as the tilak or the lineage or the identity, I didn't want it. I felt stuck in it. But he made me more human in that sense, like these very down-to-earth, beautiful qualities of just being a human being, to love one another, to see the divine in each other, and to serve the divine through each other. Also to love oneself, but not in this kind of like fluffy way, but in the sense of radical acceptance and radical authenticity. And the gift of even being able to taste sincerity instead of being so attached to how the divine is showing up in front of me externally. And these are things I wish I could have gone deeper into, the different versions of myself. Because back then, I was so focused externally, like, oh, okay, I have to dress like this, and I have to walk like this, and it has to have this words, and this is the truth. And if it's not that, like, it was just very boxed in, like in a box. But when what Guruji has shown me is that essence of love, that essence of service in all of these paths, that is the truth. Because back then, I was like, what's the truth? Right. And then I kept trying to associate truth with an external situation. And when that would dissolve, I would be like, oh my God, it's the end of the world. I don't know what's real. Instead of recognizing that thread of love and that love relationship between you and God, you and the divine, or you and the teacher even. I didn't have this concept of the guru-disciple relationship in the traditional sense, but I realized that was always there in every path that I was in. And so instead of being so traumatized during every transition, if that sort of just awareness of that thread of love and service was more present, I could have actually seen it as a gift to have so many of those experiences. Like, oh, here is a taste or a different manifestation of truth in this way. And here's another, and here's another. Instead of being like, this is wrong and this is right, and just going
moving
through
from this to this, and being frustrated almost, right?
Yeah.
But take like ISKCON experience early on.
Mm-hmm.
Don't want to wash those dishes and afraid of being brainwashed.
Yeah.
What would you say to that? Because there's a lot of people who are going to be thinking that. They come to an ashram, I'm doing things I don't want to do. I'm doing sevas that I'm not interested in. Am I being brainwashed?
Yeah. Well, I guess, like, again, back then I didn't have as much, like, I was still looking more for this, like, almost light, light in the sky, and like, that's what the divine is, and it needs to come in this like mystical explosion, and if that's not it, I'm missing the mark, So at that time I was kind of in that place, and I wasn't able to recognize the joy of just washing the dishes, But once the Vipassana came, that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to just wash the dishes, because I felt like that is the way to actually experience the love of God in the totality of this experience of life. Otherwise, there will always be this chasing for the next high or the next transcendental this, that, whatever it is, instead of recognizing the love of God in the moment. So I guess I wish I had that back in the times of the ISKCON days, but it definitely makes for a good story to hear the resistance, but also the irony of how that's what I was craving when I met Guruji. Even like, you often hear stories of people like, oh, what's my dharma, Guruji, and they want to hear like, oh, you're a healer, or you're this, like a teacher. It was the opposite for me. Of course, like, I'm not saying that I didn't. There was definitely things there, but when I first sat one-on-one with him, and I told him, I'm like kind of a yoga teacher, but I just don't want to do it anymore. I'm not really feeling it. Like, I just want to be like normal, like have a normal job, like maybe just work as a cashier somewhere and just make my life as mundane as possible so that I could, instead of what I was feeling in ISKCON when I was doing the dishes, actually catch that moment, every moment. So I was in that space of wanting to like, let me just do simple stuff, which I had a lot of that here in the beginning of my time living the ashrams here with Guruji. But when I sat with Guruji and I mentioned that, he was like, no, you're a yoga teacher, but not like they stretch in the West, like you're a teacher of the soul. And I didn't know what that meant, but the sense that I get actually, and what Guruji is really emphasizing, is like the beauty of those moments, those simple moments of doing the dishes or working in the garden or whatever opportunities to serve or do seva, and to experience that love of God in those moments, which would have made the previous me's and all those other pasts more, I guess, at peace with where I was, and also more able to interact and interface with others with different backgrounds and different paths, instead of closing myself in, like, I found the truth and it has to look like this, I
was having a conversation with Guruji about that a week ago, actually. And he was saying it's all that, like, if it's an insecurity. Like, ultimately, if you can't interact with other people, no matter their path, and you can't, in a sense, be even minimally respectful, but even more than that, it's only insecurity in your own thing, because you're so insecure that what you have isn't actually true or isn't complete, that you feel the need to judge or to distance or to attack or to separate. And it's like, if you're comfortable with what you've got and you know that what you've got is real, then you can, in a sense, interact with anything and anyone without being affected or without feeling like you're losing something. And I think that's an important realization, but it only really comes through some experience and wisdom. I mean, wisdom is, hindsight is 20/20, right? Another one that I think I wanted to unpack a little bit more with you. It's like, when that experience happened with the shaman that said, you're tired of the New Age bullshit. Mm-hmm. How would you define New Age bullshit?
Have to be careful here, huh?
Without hurting too many feelings.
Well, I guess back then I would have thought a little differently than I am now. But yeah, back then, the New Age sort of spirituality was, I would kind of define it as just a mishmash of different traditions that are not necessarily rooted in the wisdom of a grounded teacher or a master. And there's a lot of, like, let's say, drawing parallels between different traditions in a very arrogant way or a very naive way, and saying that it's unity, but not really like having a strong foundation to actually say that, and having very little understanding of what they are practicing, actually the tradition of that, where it comes from, but then just mixing it with so many other things and other sort of set of practices that, at least for me, it just felt very shallow. Right. And there wasn't an access point to go deep, really deep, because there was so much, like just like kind of a soup of too many things that perhaps were never meant to be kind of combined in that way. And so there's that. But I think the biggest thing for me actually was that I didn't see an actual like teacher, like someone embodying this, like a teaching in a way that felt deep. So it was ultimately just a very shallow ocean of trying things here and there, like a buffet. Maybe you try this, maybe you try that. And it reminds me actually of when I sat, this was right before I got initiated, I sat in the devotee course, and I heard Guruji say this during the Guru Gita, so maybe Swami Kurananda got this from him, but I was in a course, devotee course with Swami Kurananda, and he was speaking about the spiritual path and how you can keep digging holes, and what you really want is the water, the aquifer, the source of life, this nourishment, but you don't quite reach it if you keep digging in all these different holes. If you choose one hole and you keep digging and you keep digging and you keep digging and you keep digging, eventually you'll reach the aquifer, the water. And I really identified with that and related to that just from my experiences. Mm-hmm. But yeah, in the sort of New Age spirituality, it's very difficult to keep digging. It's basically just this continuation of like digging these little holes. And without the proper guidance of a teacher or a master, it's very hard to keep digging into one hole. It's very hard. So
I think one of the things that I characterize from what you're saying is like, it almost feels like people make, like you said, superficial parallels, but it's like appearances that are a little misleading. And it's like an analogy that I think of is you go to a jungle and you find a bunch of berries and you say, oh, look, they're all berries. They're all the same because they're berries. Somehow there's a general grouping, and then you start to eat them. It's like some are sweet, some are sour, and some are poisonous. And it's like only if somebody who knows goes, yeah, well, that berry gives you that result, that berry gives you that result, and that berry gives you that result. Which result do you want? Because if you pick them all and throw them in a bowl and just start eating them like it's popcorn, you're going to get all three results mixed together, which is A, going to be terrible, like the taste, and B, you might even get poisoned and die.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't mean that obviously physically, but in some sense, spiritually, maybe even. And I feel like a lot of what I've encountered with New Age ideas and people is that there's a lot of goodwill, there's a lot of good intentions, and there's a lot of people that act out innate, I think, spiritual inclinations like harmony. We want to harmonize things. We want unity. Because I think it's a spiritual quality to unite, not to divide. But I think because, as you said, there isn't a master guiding that process, saying like, hey, this is how the puzzle can come together. You just sort of mash it together into this like incoherent thing sometimes. And it's like, you go, well, look, it's together. It is together. Like it is harmonized, but not in a coherent way, right? And it can really get messy. And another example I give sometimes to people is just through maths. I go like, okay, you want to get to 10? You can add 3 and 7, you'll get to 10. And you can add 4 and 6 and you'll get to 10. But if you start mixing them, like I'll take the 7 from the first equation and the 6 from the other, and now I've got 13. And it's like, so I'm always a little skeptical when humans that are, as you say, not masters, start to mix things and say like, oh yeah, this is all compatible and this all works well together. And it's just, does it really though? Because I think one of the beautiful things that Guruji's taught me is discernment, not from a judgmental space. Like he validates a lot of things, but he's like, discernment. These things don't necessarily mix, and these things lead to different outcomes. And it's not that the outcome is better or worse. It's what do you want? And I think New Age people sometimes need to be confronted by those kind of ideas, but not devil's advocate. Sometimes what the New Age people will say is that, again, you're boxing things in. You are limiting things. You're creating rules and boundaries instead of freedom. What does Nikunja say to that?
It's a good conversation, actually. Yeah. You know, I was actually thinking, I don't remember when, it's totally random, but I went to play paddle, paddle.
I've played it as well, yeah.
With Simone, and we're just playing with no rules, no constraints, just kind of like free flowing, just hitting the ball, and if it goes out the line, if it hits the wall, if it bounces this many times, it doesn't matter. We were playing with just no rules. Yeah. And it was fun. I was having fun, But then when Simone introduced the sort of rules and the structure, like you can't step out this line, it's this many bounces, la la la. Then we start to play. And I noticed how differently I was playing and just how, of course, the mind shifts, becomes more focused, more single-pointed. And in that, within that structure that is given, you're able to really refine. So there's this refinement that happens, a sharpening, and a sort of skill that emerges that would not have been possible without the structure. So even if the free playing around is fun, you don't realize what you could have with the structure. So I thought about...
Nice answer. Go play paddle, everyone.
Go play paddle and follow the guidelines.
Yeah.
Yeah. But this is how I guess I've experienced being with Guruji, because also being on so many different paths, even though I was on many and it went very deep, it wasn't that long. It was like 1 year maximum in each situation. And so I've been with Guruji now for 6 years, and it's the longest I've been with one teacher, one path. And there's very specific guidelines and lifestyle choice once you become a devotee, which at first maybe if one is very attached to what they think is freedom, they might see those guidelines and say, oh, that's a limitation, which is understandable. But again, I was familiar with many of these things before, but still, to follow those for 6 years is a decent amount of time. I still consider myself very new, but it's the longest amount of time for me in the context of my journey. There's a, I wouldn't call it a skill, but it is this like sense of freedom from being so bound by all these things I thought I needed in the material world or whatever it may be, to be happy, to be content, to feel love, like all these conditions that I thought I needed, to access those things, when in fact those very things were the distraction, and it was a sort of illusory freedom. But it wasn't until I kind of played by the rules, let's say, that a freedom I didn't know was possible started to emerge.
Could you describe it a little more, what that freedom feels like?
Yeah, I think it's this. So again, this prayer that I had very early on of experiencing unconditional love, and just ultimately digging towards truth was more at the forefront than love in the beginning. Honestly, I just wanted like the truth. So this sort of quest for truth and love, meeting Guruji, he became this sort of mirror by which I saw all of my, as I said before, conditions and judgments and stories around what does it mean to love? Like, what is the truth? Like, he just exposed everything. Things that I didn't know were inside. But I don't think it would have been possible to see those things without, of course, him, but also the lifestyle that he has paved for us, which does involve customs, ways of being, and different rules. And it, of course, reminds me of the famous Gita verse where it's like, what first is like poison becomes the nectar, but the happiness that is like nectar in the beginning becomes poison. And so, of course, there was an element of having to persevere and need a lot of resilience to keep going with the structure he had been giving. Because it's not like, oh, I feel free instantly because I've taken these vows and da-da-da-da-da, Yeah. It depends on how much baggage we come with, right? And even though I've had a lot of experiences, I'm not so sure if it was blessing or not, because there was a lot that kind of had to unravel. So it's not that this fragrance of freedom, which I can't say I know it completely at all, but it has come bit by bit through staying within the structure and the framework that he has given, persevering, and moments where it'd be very easy to run away. And then usually after some periods of those like churning of the ocean, intense challenges, there would be a taste of, oh, I no longer need this external material thing to be okay right now. It's like that simple. Sometimes I don't think people have the chance to see what type of attachments are being formed to different things in their life, even if it's a little thing. Even had an experience, first time I stayed in Vrindavan, at the beginning of my journey with Guruji, I stayed for like 3.5 months. I thought I was never going to leave. I'm like, oh my God, I'm never going to leave his place. Like, and I was staying in like a 6-person room, and I had a bottom bunk, and there was a old lady that was moving into the room, and they were like, she can't climb up the stairs. One of you has to go to the top bunk. And I was, just to say, I was on the bottom bunk and I had tucked sheets in around the edges. So I was like, in my little cave and no one could see me. And I just observed my reaction at just the thought of having to sacrifice this little bubble. And I was noticing, I was like, okay. But it was getting really strong, like, no, this is my space. And then I hear the voice getting louder and I'm like, I thought I was like, a pretty detached person, like whatever. And then it was getting so loud. I'm like, if you keep thinking this, you're for sure going to be the one to have to move. Nobody was volunteering. So eventually we flipped a coin. It was me. And it was crazy to observe my reaction. I'm like pulling the sheets off the bed, like, just having a fit, like a tantrum. And yeah, went to the top bunk and I was mostly just observing my reaction and really surprised. And I'm just saying this because there are all, like, being with Guruji, he'll kind of, the ashram environment, let's say even, there'll be these sort of simulations to reveal these little things where you're not free, actually. It's like, oh, wait, I'm so spiritual and I'm like singing and devoting my life to God. And then the moment I have to give an elderly woman the bottom bunk, have a temper tantrum, And so I would say that sense of freedom that I feel now with Guruji has shown up in very kind of seemingly simple moments like that. But it's revealing all those little things we don't even realize we're clinging onto, materially speaking.
I sometimes feel like being with Guruji is like a material attachment school.
Yes.
He's just showing you all the material attachments, gross and subtle, like through different episodes, and that's the school we're going through.
Mm-hmm.
I also love hearing these things coming from you, because I think for people, when I say it, I'm sitting here, renounced, orange clothes, sitting in an ashram, been with Guruji since I'm 15. They go, of course you're comfortable with the rules and the lifestyle and structure and all this renunciation and whatever else. But here we go, right? Like all the experiences that you mapped out, everything that you've gone through, and it's like we're seeing things in a very similar way, because I think it's not actually all that different. The lifestyles don't necessarily impact what's actually happening at the end of the day. This material attachment school, in a sense, that we're just, in a sense, understanding our own things.
Yeah.
Just last night, 2 of my godbrothers, monks, were told by Guruji to swap rooms. Just swap your rooms. They rooms the whole night, right? And I was observing, is there any resistance? Like those things, little comforts. And at first, I think there was a little. And then it starts to get overcome slowly as they start to realize that at this stage of the game, should I be having attachment to little things like that?
Yeah.
And, you almost diagnose yourself and like fix yourself, because he's exposed the situation by just prompting something so random as you 2 swap rooms with no real like strong cause. It's just like, just do it. And then I was with one of them last night when he was moving into his new room, and he was like, I'm starting to feel secondhand nervousness and anxiety because I'm moving all the things out that used to belong to the other monk to his room, and I'm overwhelmed by how much stuff he has. Because he's a minimalist, right? And he's like, he has so much stuff, I'm getting nervous. And I'm like, again, there we go. Like, it's more, we're in, classes in session, right? And it's just amazing how these things just happen. Doesn't matter what you are, if you're a monk or not, like this stuff's going on all the time. Guruji.
Yeah. And just to highlight again, like what I was sharing before about how amazing mystical experience can be and how beautiful, but those things you can actually hide behind a lot. And so when people ask me to share about Guruji, I never really talk about the mystical, supernatural things, not even my past. Like, this is the first time I've gone so in depth publicly about this. Just
I'm
what
honored.
happened. But I avoid it actually at all costs, because even though it is great and it is valuable to recognize his divinity, and at least in my experiences, the real lessons come from these little moments and these little experiences amongst each other in community, whether it's in the ashram or it's not limited to the ashram, as you say, many experiences with Simone and I and our lifestyle, which is, also very colorful, let's say. And even though it's very colorful and full of exciting things and a lot of travel, international travel, it's often in the little moments, where the opportunity to observe and see what's holding you back from being free is present in those little moments. And Guruji and the structure he gives and the teachings he gives helps us be able to see that more clearly moment to moment rather than being consumed by it. And yeah, that's why usually when people ask me about Guruji, I just talk about the very down-to-earth things he's done in my life, because that's, for me, the greatest miracle.
I love that.
Yeah.
I genuinely love that, because I feel like it's the same thing when I talk about Guruji. People want to hear about miracles that he's done.
Yeah.
What kind of things has he shown you, whatever. And I'm like, he's shown me how to love. He's shown me how to detach. He's shown me how to overcome myself in different moments and different things. It's like, oh, you want to hear about manifestations and visions and snapping his fingers and fireballs and whatever else he can, like, no, because those things, they may have happened, but they've had, comparatively speaking, very little impact on me compared to these subtle, smaller, more mundane things where a little conversation or a little instruction for me to go and do something, washing some dishes, shows me something about myself, and that eventually a switch gets flipped and that never gets flipped back, in a sense, and I've just become a different person because of that. And I mean, it makes complete sense. And I think sometimes people from the outside looking in to Guruji and Bhakti Marga, they think, oh, these people only follow him because of the show, because he materializes rings and whatever else. And it's like,
it's the opposite for me.
Well, I think people sometimes don't think like that. You're right.
Yeah.
Like, I sometimes tell people, like, even now as a podcast host and whatever, when I sit here and talk about supernatural miracles that Guruji does, you think I'm not aware that I'm losing a bunch of people the minute I start speaking about that? I'm not gaining, because people immediately go, like, just skeptical. Clearly he's, brainwashed by tricks and whatever else. And yet I talk about it almost matter-of-factly because, well, I've just experienced them, but they're not actually the crux of why I'm here or why most of these people are here. Mm-hmm. And so if there are any devotees, actually, of Guruji that still are fascinated by that stuff above the rest, I would recommend you to listen to what we've just said, because it's not about that. It really isn't. And you paint a wrong picture for people outside of what it is that Guruji is really doing in your lives. Mm-hmm. You've learned to love because of what he's done for you in the subtle moments, in the everyday moments, not because he once made you a ring. And that ring is just pumping love into your life. Like, it's not like that. It really, really isn't. You mentioned the Gita earlier, Nikunja. Mm-hmm. Before I don't want us to finish this conversation without addressing this. Guruji's given you, as I understand, an adesh, an instruction of a seva to do with the Gita. Mm-hmm. Over to you. But what is it? How has it been for you? Like, what's the whole... Let's unpack that.
Beautiful, yeah. I think it's a great sort of grand finale. Because as I said, like, for me, my experience with the Bhagavad Gita was not an intellectual pursuit until recently, but it kept appearing in my life at different times and giving me sort of understanding of my experiences. So... The second time I sat with Guruji, we were having a one-on-one. I was actually addressing him with some, doubts and things that I had going on. And eventually it led to him kind of touching my tilak and like opening it up, and was like, one day this will open. And then he tapped me 3 times on the third eye and said, one day you will teach the Gita. And I have to say something really embarrassing, but like from that point on, I started to like try to draw my tilak more wide, because he said, let that wisdom come out. I'm like, okay, where is it? Like, maybe if I make the tilak
like open up the
a
curtains
little wider, it'll come out.
Right.
I don't do that anymore. But yeah, there was a phase. So that was the first time, and that was still very early on, like 5 years ago. I don't think it was even 1 year in, but of initiation. But and then that kind of planted the seed for me to pursue it more intellectually. So I was listening to classes. But he also like set things up perfectly, because then during COVID, I was with him. We were together, and he asked you and Swami Akash, he was Rishi at that time, to give Bhagavad Gita courses. And so it was just perfectly lined up for me to just dive in more consciously, let's say, into the Gita. I even approached you a couple times about it. And so I didn't start teaching, obviously, right away. But I just started to go into it more consciously. And it was very beautiful. Like, I love the Gita. And, okay, I'll get to that later. But it's just when I started this kind of project and people approached me and they're like, gosh, I didn't even know the Gita was that beautiful until I listened to this song and saw this video. I was like, it's so beautiful. And it doesn't need that for it to be beautiful, you know? So anyone that's listening, read the Bhagavad Gita. Anyway, so that was the first time, and then I was just studying more, and then the following year, I think it was the following year, Guruji. Oh no, it was after COVID. Guruji revealed Shri Vitthala Giridhari Parabrahmane Namaha, the mantra. And in that moment, I had just parted ways from him in Vrindavan, and I was just like in such a deep space of gratitude for being with him in that time during COVID. I didn't realize it in the moment, but after leaving, I was like, oh my gosh, what a blessing that was. And when he gave the mantra, I just suddenly heard this melody and grabbed the harmonium and started to sing the mantra. And I sent it to Guruji just as a thank you. I was like, thank you for this time, for me being able to be with you during COVID, especially. And he called me right away. I missed the call. But then I was like, oh my God, he called me. And he sent me a text and was like, oh my gosh, this is so beautiful. Can you share it? He said, can you share it on Facebook? I didn't even really use Facebook anymore, but he was like, can you share it on Facebook so the rest of the world can benefit? And I was like, oh, okay. You know, at this time, little background now, one of my main sevas is devotional singing, but this is because of Guruji. Like, the emphasis in the beginning was more on teaching. I wasn't thinking about singing at all, but it just came like as a way of saying thank you to him, a devotional expression of love to him. And even in Vrindavan, that was the first time I kind of started to sing a little bit, and everyone was like, "Oh, you sing?" And like I was playing Mridanga and stuff. And so after that, I shared it with Rishi Aradhika, and then he shared it on the page. And then Guruji, from that point on, was like, this is what you're here to do. You're here to sing and spread the divine name. Focus on this. Simone will help you. It's a whole conversation. After that, we were walking together in the forest, and he said, after a conversation, he looked at me and said to sing the Bhagavad Gita in English. And he repeated it like 3 or 4 times. He said, in English, though. Do it in English. And I was like, okay. Every single verse? Or he's like, yes, every verse. And I was like, all right. And I was super inspired. And I went back and like produced a song. But I didn't start from the beginning initially because he didn't give me like clear instruction until a little bit later. So I was like, I'm just going to flip open to a page and that's the one that I start with. And I flipped open to the Buddha Yoga, you know.
Quite poetic chapter.
Yeah, it felt like a good place to start. And I didn't sing every verse. I just chose 4, made a little kind of summary and shared it with Guruji. He really liked it. And then we talked more about how he wants it to be. And he said, yeah, at first you can do these sort of artistic summaries of each chapter, but start from the beginning this time, not with 10. Start with chapter 1. And then after you can sing every verse. And I said, okay. So then I started with chapter 1. And so basically the project is to sing the verses in English, but summarize sort of each chapter. But the rate at which it has been coming through is a lot slower than I was planning, because I was super adamant about just like, okay, it's going to be done in like 3 months. It's been like 3 years, and I just put out chapter 3. I really wonder sometimes, my Guruji, am I going to get through this? Like, I don't know, because I quickly realized it wasn't that I was creating it. He was teaching me and guiding me through it.
Right.
And when there was a culmination of, or a fruition of sort of just connection or revelation to that teaching, not like full realization, but, there was a sort of completion of a test in relation to the teachings of each chapter I was working on. Mm-hmm. It would finally be time to release, but it's been very, very slow. I remember at first I was moving really fast, and I was like, I messaged Guruji, and I was like, hey, I finished 1 and chapter 2 is all produced, and now I'm working on 3. And he was like, oh, you're moving really fast. And as soon as he said that, I was like, uh-oh. I somehow, like, there was this inner knowing of like, he's going to slow things down. So it's actually been one of the most profound experiences of my life, because the way the teachings, whatever, verse I was singing or working on would manifest in my life has just blown me away. Like, I have a separate journal just to keep track of all of the experiences he's given me to demonstrate the teachings. So, again, it's not about like me creating anything per se, but him using that as a vehicle to transmit these teachings in a way to share, maybe perhaps more with modern audiences, because that is the kind of demographic that I tend to appeal to. So they're more modern compositions, still with some traditional influence, but this is a project, and now I'm on chapter 4. Amazing. Let's see what happens moving forward.
It's nice. I think I like to hear like Guruji, because Guruji asked you to do this, and it's just like then that he knows what audience you're going to appeal to, and he knows that when he says do it in English, like it's all planned out. Obviously, he knows what the vision is, and it's like it's really nice just to see how Guruji's caring for everyone. Somehow he's just like, let's make sure that we're really reaching out with this, amazing wisdom, amazing life-changing wisdom to every demographic that we can, in ways that are going to touch them, in ways that are going to make impact in their life. You said that you originally didn't engage with the Gita in an intellectual way, and that's changed recently. Do you feel like that's impacted anything that you've been doing with this singing work, that's given you different perspectives, or it's just been somehow not really playing a role in that? How do you see that?
It's played a big role, a very big role. And I also have been going through the Academy platform and doing the knowledge training and learning so much from all of you. And it's been essential, actually. And I also think that's why, one of the reasons why this, I gather, it could be one of the reasons why Guruji has slowed it down. Because there's just so much to learn, and the active, consistent pursuit of digging in to one line repeatedly, and observing it from different angles, which you have helped me a lot actually with that, and all the teachers, to see things that I just wasn't coming naturally. Like, I've had always a intuitive sort of relationship to the Gita, more experience-based, but there's so much more that can be sort of revealed, understood, whatever it may be, through actively and consciously applying your mind and your intelligence to see what these teachings are about, to the extent that is possible, of course. Sure. Because the reality is the Gita is very much about grace too. And but it's so practical And it's so systematic in the same way that I loved Vipassana, how the technique is it's a science. There's a science to it. It's mapped out and it works. It's time tested throughout the ages. And it's the same with the Gita, I feel. And so, I mean, I know a lot of people have different experiences with it, and it depends on their past as well. But I definitely encourage everyone to approach it in the way of not like trying to force oneself to intellectually understand, because it doesn't come through that way sometimes. It's just not the right moment for you to grasp the teaching. But there are there is a system to it and a science that when you approach it more in that way, you can get a lot. You can get a lot of it. But Guruji does often say, many times I've heard him say, that the Gita can't be read just intellectually.
Sure.
It has to be, and it's not just like a story. You have to really connect with it and open yourself to receive what can be given, you know.
I mean, the podcast is called Thinking Bhakti. And it's really like, for me, it was always about that. Is how to properly marry these things, because I think sometimes people go into extremes where it's like, no, it's only heart. You know, the mind is just a bad thing. Dismiss it. And some people go, oh, these people, it's just sentimentalism. You know, you got to have a sharp intellect. And I think it's the marriage of the two, sort of a holistic approach to it. So this is nice. This is very nice. Thank you so much for sharing. Hope it goes well. Chapter 4 and beyond.
Thank you so much.
Maybe next time we have a conversation, you'll be on chapter 8 or something like this.
Way down the line.
Appreciate the conversation. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Jai Gurudev.
Jai Gurudev, Nikunja.